cases. So if we take RBS GRG, for example, and the thousands of small businesses, each of those are individual cases.
Right.
The regulator sat on the GRG scandal for the best part of a decade without taking any action until they were forced to by Parliament. The regulator says they're independent. The question we all have as researchers, campaigners and victims is, how does the regulator deal with these individual cases and begin to look at when we've had 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 victims, in the case of GRG, anywhere between 16,000 and 70,000 victims. What is the volume at which the regulator should be forced to act? And they refuse to answer that question. So you've got the FCA.
But should it be a volume question? I mean, one case...
Should it be a risk? Yeah. Should it be a risk-based approach? Should it be, yeah, I mean, as you say, one case. If this case has a potential to result in other customers, other businesses being caught up in this...
So they sit back...
Shouldn't we take preventative action? That's a fundamental question which...
100%. But they sit back, they wait, and they see what happens in the market, as it were. And then when cases are brought, or when more and more activity, a flurry of activity around certain businesses starts to emerge, do they then take action?
Generally not. I mean, what it often takes is, so in the case of GRG, it took Lawrence Tomlinson, who was an advisor to Vince Cable in the business department. It took his report in 2013 and the media and parliamentary interest around that to actually force the regulator to set up at the time what was a relatively kind of captured one-sided report from Clifford Chance. So, even when you get media interest, when you get large numbers of victims coming forward, often that's even not enough to force action. So here we are in 2017, 4 years later, we still haven't seen the regulator's report.
So the banks set the rules, those institutions are in a sense ring-fenced, there are gaps, and you're one of the people, one of the victims who fell into the gap.
Absolutely. I mean, what I've done as an investigator is I've taken the theory that Joel's speaking about, which is that everybody points at everybody else. So the FCA points at the police and the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. They point at the police and the FCA. The police point at the ICO and the FCA. So you never get anywhere. And it's a circle. It's a complete circle. Nobody seems to have any appetite to break whatsoever.
And what's disgusting about this, when you talk to, as a victim, RBS, guy by the name of Nigel Henderson, he's been fighting for justice in his case for 20 years, writing to regulator after regulator. We've been through a couple of rebrands of the FCA now, been through 3 or 4 kind of parliaments over that period, and, nobody's taken any action. And even in his case, where now everyone knows about RBS GRG, his case precedes, the FCA has set an arbitrary limit on their investigation into GRG, which starts in 2008. There's a lot of evidence out there that sort of practice within RBS was going on for at least a decade prior. And so Nigel Henderson isn't even part of the review of RBS GRG and their predecessor, which is called Specialised Lending Services. So they've put these kind of arbitrary limits around the whole thing to try and contain it and to minimise the number of victims. And for these reasons, the FCA, when you ask them via FOI, for instance, how many victims have come to you from RBS GRG and its predecessors, they will never give you a number. They'll refuse to make that information public.
And FOI is freedom of information, isn't it?
Well, I think the interesting thing, really, with the FCA is that they refuse to accept that a fraud, for example, or a forged document is a regulatory breach. So, as an example, if you said that as a regulation you must get people to sign their loan forms, for example. So if you don't sign it, or you don't get somebody to sign it, the FCA would say, well, that's a breach. It's a breach of regulations. You can't do that, and they'll be all over them like a ton of bricks. But if they say, if the bank says, oh, we haven't got a signature here, we'll make one up and forge one, the FCA will then say, well, that's nothing to do with us.
These are quite explosive claims, the one that you have just made. So we have to be very, very clear. What you're asserting, what you're alleging, is that a bank like RBS has used fraud to mimic or to counterfeit signatures on documents which have been used to either take businesses down, used in court. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
But the difficulty here is people just hear that and don't believe it.
Well, I think that was the case. Most certainly it was the case back in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12. Nobody believed you when you were saying these things. But now there's a collective. I think people are believing you now. They are beginning to come over. There are more MPs in the House that are interested in what's going on. They've heard the same complaint too many times for it not to be true. The excuses coming from RBS are ridiculous.
What are they?
Well, just denial. Things like, well, we might not have treated the customer quite correctly, but you know, we're okay now.
It was a problem with Microsoft Word. It was
Yes.
It was Microsoft's problem, not our fault. I mean, you know, these are the sorts of...
Let's blame Microsoft.
What's Microsoft got to do with it? You know, this is, you're saying it's out and out fraud.
I've got a letter in here from RBS on Virgin one-headed paper, if you don't mind.
What have they got to do with it?
My mortgage is called a NatWest One account, which was purchased from Virgin in 2002. So in 2003, all paperwork relating to Virgin should have gone. And in 2015 and 16, it suddenly arises again when they're trying to defend what they've done with my files by saying that inadvertent capitalisation has happened when they've extracted information from emails of mine and put it into my customer records. It's got rid of the first part of a sentence, capitalised the next word, and used the remaining part of the sentence as the sentence.
Mind the gap.
And they're blaming Microsoft.
It's mind the gap on transcription. When these things are put into different files, things go missing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you've evidenced this?
I've gone through files painstakingly to make sure that they're absolutely accurate and what I'm saying is correct.
And John Hurricane, who's a senior RBS banker, one of their investment bankers, in 2009, he gave a speech in Amsterdam, I believe it was, to RBS, ABN AMRO staff. He referenced the fact there was 1,000 what he called data cleaners within RBS who were working somewhere in the back office.
What are they called?
Data cleaners.
Data cleaners.
And he said there's around 1,000 of these individuals within RBS who are going through, looking at these documents and making, we believe, these falsifications.
1,000 of the 10,000 people in the back office do data cleanup and reconciliation. You do not want that on your gravestone. I was a data cleaner. You know, it must be one of the most soul-destroying things to do for your life, right? We have to rescue our people from that.
So the question is obviously, you know, what were these individuals doing, and to what extent, as you've documented here, were these documents then entered into courts, used to bankrupt companies, individuals, partnerships, and effectively, you know, ruin people's lives?
Andy, turning to your case, walk us through it.
Very briefly, we made a complaint against a credit team manager at RBS WorldPay. We were later told by a senior manager in NatWest that we were on the to-get list. And we were put on the board as terminal.
What does that mean?
That means
sounds like a hospital list.
They're going to be terminated.
Oh, dear.
We found 4 years after we stopped trading that this manager and his sidekick were making up false information about our company and myself as a director and my fellow directors, and making false claims about the risk that we posed to the bank. And we told them that we were moving to Barclays because we'd had a loan from Barclays to expand our business.
What was your business, incidentally?
It was an identification system for cats and dogs, turning over about £1 million a year, just over, with a high net profit. And behind the scenes, we discovered that RBS was saying that we were illiquid at exactly the same time that Barclays was giving us a loan to expand the business, which is what we did.
Were you illiquid?
We were not illiquid, but we did get terminated. We got a notice of termination, and 12 days before the notice of termination, we got an offer for £2.5 million from Graham Dacre, CBE, after 4 months of due diligence to buy the business and keep us all on as directors and move it forward and go to the next stage. Shortly after that, they changed our terms of business, where all of our sales came through credit and debit card revenue, which had to go through this RBS WorldPay system.
Yes.
And 3 days later, you get the money.
Yes.
They wrote to us and said, well, for the next 4 days, you can trade in that way. After 4 days, we'll be keeping your money for at least 10 years. And
For what reason?
For no reason. They wouldn't give us a reason.
A decade?
A decade.
Presumably you had a contract which said
3 days.
3 days. And they
So they breached that?
Oh, yeah. From that point on, I had 30 staff all on the phones making sales. All the money went through the system and never came back out again. And 6 weeks later, I had to give immediate notice to 30 of my staff that they were redundant on that moment. And that was it. It was horrible. It was the worst moment in my life. It makes me want to cry now, and I'm not far off it. We had a successful business. The staff laughed at me. They thought I called a meeting to give them all a bonus for Christmas. And
what do you say to them?
Well, it was when I started crying that so did they. And they came and hugged me, and we all went down the pub. And that was the last of my business. And funnily enough, we had an email from RBS DLA Piper, their solicitors the day before, saying that provided we agreed to stop trading on the next day, they'd release the money for me to pay my staff wages, but only on the condition that we took no action against them. And you're told by even your own solicitors, no, this isn't crime, this is how it goes. And it's civil, it's civil, it's civil. And you kind of fall into this it's civil business.
Right.
And you're thinking, no, but this is blackmail, this is a crime, this is fraud. This is a forgery. Right. I met Lawrence Tomlinson in 2013.
And he's an entrepreneur who wrote a report about RBS.
Yeah, I met him at the Department of Business and went through some of the cases that he had. Together, we said, crikey, this is not civil, this is crime.
And they had the hallmarks of exactly the same.
Absolutely. And it's systematic crime. And it amounts to things like false transcripts of telephone conversations, customer files, records of meetings that didn't take place, or telephone calls that didn't take place. You've even got a stamp that they use to make sure that something's confidential, so that if they give it to the financial ombudsman, for example, it says, don't give this to the customer. And the reason you don't give it to the customer is because it's not what the customer's got. The customer's got a completely different document to the one that the bank produces.
So you've got all this information asymmetry. Yeah. You've got, and I mean, this is, well, it's out and out fraud.
Yeah, it is. It is, absolutely. Well, it's forgery.
And this is where the FCA becomes a major problem, because what they tell you is that we will not investigate individual cases. And so how does a victim demonstrate that there are multiple other cases which fit the exact same pattern as what you have? Essentially what you're doing is victim blaming. You're going to the victim and saying, we're not going to touch this until you can find dozens of other examples which replicate the problem you've got. Then we might look at it. And that's where we are. And I've made dozens of calls to the FCA, and it was only on one of those most recent calls where someone actually explained to me that if you raise an issue with the regulator, they often won't take a formal record of that issue you've raised unless you go through a formal whistleblowing process. The average person doesn't necessarily think of themselves as a whistleblower. You don't work in the institution you're complaining about. I'm not a whistleblower, I'm a concerned citizen, I'm a victim. So unless you specify to the regulator that this is a whistleblowing issue, then it goes to another kind of route, to a different team in the FCA, and they might look at it. But for average kind of conversations that the public might have with the regulator, it's not adequately explained that they're not going to take any action on that information.
Right. Looking at the transcripts, that is the only way they can do this, is to take a proper transcript, go through it and say, right, we'll change this, we'll change that, and then they come up with a transcript that isn't the correct one, send it to you with a declaration at the top saying this is accurate. And there are over 1,000 examples within that 1.5 hour transcript. There's over 1,123 that have been independently verified, where they've completely changed the context of a sentence by removing words, and in some cases putting words in.
And let's just remember, this is the Royal Bank of Scotland, which banks the Queen, Coots, and here we have allegations that as many as 1,000 people could be systematically falsifying customer records.
Data cleaners. Data cleaners.
And then that information being used against the customers in court without their knowledge. What we've done, we've tried to protect banks like RBS at all costs. Already with a toxic culture, you've then had the chance to say, we want you to return to the private sector as fast as possible, double down, destroy your customers in the process to kind of repair your balance sheet. And so you have a culture which is already toxic, become even more so, in a rush to reprivatise a bank, which should have been let fail. What we have is a regulator protecting what is indefensible behaviour by the bank, and nothing being done to rectify the core issues, which is the complete lack of trust and faith and integrity in the financial system.
And the people within the organisation, specifically the whistleblowers, who've understood how toxic the culture is, that it is a war, and they see what's going on, they want to come out, they want to talk about it. What happens to them now?
As a whole, they get, they're destroyed. There is no protection, there is no financial reward for whistleblowers, so they lose their career. Often they lose their family, their house, future employment prospects.
Their mental health.
Their mental health. And, the entire system for public interest disclosure is unfit for purpose, because basically you need to lose your job, go right through a tribunal process and be proved a whistleblower. And generally what will happen is the bank will settle before that process. And so you've got to risk everything as a whistleblower to get anywhere. And so we really need to be talking about changing the whistleblowing laws in the UK to get to the heart of the corruption in the city.